First thing to talk about today is Afghanistan, where all the news is really around what Joe Biden is going to do and how many people is he going to evacuate. There's a lot of numbers being thrown around about how many people the U.S. is getting out. I'm skeptical of these numbers right now. As of the recording of the show, it looks like about 60,000 is what the U.S. is claiming since August 14th. That would be about 10 days. Now, I'm not certain, but I think they are including the other NATO coalition numbers when they say when they say 60,000. And that's how over the weekend, the number went from like 7,000 to 25,000. I think they start to roll in the NATO number, although I'm not absolutely positive on that. And, we're still, I think, trying to get clarity on actually how many people are being evacuated. The other thing that isn't clear is how many of the Americans that are in Afghanistan want to leave and are being evacuated. I've seen numbers being thrown around about 7,000 Americans have been evacuated, although the estimates of number of Americans in Afghanistan is quite a wide range between 10 and 15,000. And so it seems absolutely possible to me that either half the Americans are out, or at 7,000 plus the people at the Kabul airport, maybe just about everybody who wants to leave is there if the number is closer to 10,000 or maybe a little bit lower. Now, when you hear 10,000 Americans, that could mean, or 10 to 15,000 Americans, that could mean a lot of things. It could mean like 10 to 15,000 US, like American people who are born in the United States, aid workers. And that number seems like that would be a lot. But I think this probably includes this war has been going on for 20 years. And so there's a lot of, Afghans who have gotten American citizenship throughout the war as they have been a part of the American war effort or government in Afghanistan. And, they've probably had families. And so that adds to a number of people. If they have since gone back to Afghanistan for any reason, that could significantly add to the numbers. It's unclear how many contractors are still in Afghanistan, and I'm guess that they would be included in this number. Up to very recently, they were still advertising jobs for contractors, and the Pentagon was still awarding contracts for the year 2021. And so there could be thousands of contractors potentially in Afghanistan, although I would guess that a lot of the Pentagon contractors had things wrapped up in their contracts terminated or whatever as the Afghan government no longer exists. Although, again, the numbers are unclear. Now, if you look at the U.S. mainstream media reporting about this, it's all about, we're not getting our people out, and there's so many people that still want to go that we're should take and we're not taking. I think it's unclear how much this is the case. There's certainly a lot of people at the Kabul airport. How many of them are actually going to qualify under the State Department visa program for those visas? I'm not sure. It seems like there's quite a few people being turned away. I was just looking at some reporting today from, I believe, CNN, who had interviewed 2 or 3 people who had claimed to work for the U.S. government at some time who were denied these visas. And so then you also have groups of people, at least it's being reported, that are being removed from Afghanistan, and it's not clear if they're actually going to qualify for the visas, and so they may be sent back, which seems like it may put them at even more heightened risk, right? Because then you now have to re-enter the country. I'm assuming the Taliban at some point are going to set up a more formal custom system, and when people enter their country, they're going to say, hey, who are you and what are you doing here, just like when you come into the United States. And if that happens, that could present a problem for these groups of people. Now, there's a lot of questions about if everybody who wants to leave is being allowed to leave by the Taliban. And this is really being wrapped up in the, Taliban are brutal and they're not going to let everybody out. I'm not sure. There's, reports from the U.S. government in particular saying that the Taliban are still allowing people, particularly foreign nationals, to leave the country. uh, I'm just not sure about all this. I could tell you guys what's being reported and what made sense. The numbers that the U.S. are putting out, they're all possible. The 10 to 15,000 Americans, it's possible 7,000 have gotten out. It's possible they've evacuated 60,000 people. Who knows how many more are waiting and how long it's going to take to process them. But I think the goal is to make it portrayed in the Western press that they're not going to be able to get all the people out that should be eligible to leave by August 31st, and we need to stay longer. Now, Joe Biden had set that as the original date, August 31st, and of today we got an announcement from the White House that he will be sticking with that. There was some reason to doubt that he might stick with this number. There were a lot of U.S. officials, I believe even Biden himself, said that no Americans would be left behind, but either they feel comfortable that no Americans who want to leave will either be able to get to the Kabul airport by August 31st or ever, or that they'll have them all out by August 31st. And so that's to the best of my ability, what I could, say as is happening in Afghanistan surrounding the situation. Again, I think you're going to get a much more elevated narrative of the chaos coming from the Western media. I think some of the chaos, again, couldn't have been avoided. We talked about this on the last show, that there were going to be people in Afghanistan who the U.S. wasn't going to take for whatever. Maybe they have connections or family connections to whatever groups, or maybe they were poppy growers or heroin growers, whatever was involved, and that could create a panic scene at the airport. I'm not sure how many people the Taliban are going to Afghans the Taliban are going to allow to leave. You do have a situation here, and we have seen this before with like the communists building the wall in Berlin to prevent people from leaving. And so if you do have a somewhat repressive government, and you have citizens, like from a logistical standpoint of the Taliban, not necessarily just out of pure cruelty, they could see it as a way, that if all the doctors leave, it's going to put them in a bigger problem. And so they're going to stop allowing doctors to leave the country or something like that. I could also imagine there being a situation here too, where with the amount of U.S. funding that has gone into Afghanistan in the past 20 years, that a lot of officials, a lot of people who have advanced degrees, doctors, engineers, stuff like that, could have been trained in U.S. NGO programs, and that's kind of going to create what they've called brain drains in other areas, where you're just going to have a lot of people who are critical to making sure people could get running water and electricity into their homes, that there's doctors and nurses and stuff. If maybe a huge number of these people have been trained by U.S. NGOs and are now looking to get out, the Taliban could face a real situation where everybody's going to exit, and it's not exactly clear what level of cruelty that the Taliban are going to exact. And hell, just to talk about the conditions here, and this is something that I have been bringing up on the show for several months, something I was concerned about from very early on, because the U.S. bureaucracy and just logistics work so poorly. And then once, the U.S. built government of Afghanistan fell faster than the U.S. government predicted, I had been concerned that essentially there wasn't going to be systems, food, shelter, sanitation, housing set up for the refugees leaving Afghanistan. And there's a report from Axios that describes the Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar. This is the main place that the U.S. is taking the refugees, called it a living hell. An email, and again, this is from unnamed sources that they're getting from the military. An unnamed official said that there was feces and urine and rats on the floor, and it sounds like just a huge health hazard, right? Forget for a second about if they're doing COVID tests or what's going on with that, but just looking from the typical health concerns of cholera, other disease breaking out. Hell, Afghanistan is a country that has a problem with wild polio, and so if kids aren't vaccinated for polio and there's feces on the ground, that could be an issue. I think we could look at a wide variety of issues that could come when you have again human excrement on the ground, which is reported to be the case now in Qatar for the refugees. And so they could be facing a more hellish situation because they're afraid of the Taliban than they'll actually face staying in Afghanistan. But then that just is me speculating. It's not clear what kind of oppression, increased oppression people are going to face in Afghanistan, now that the Taliban are in charge, or that would be even increased for all these people. The previous government was cruel and very corrupt. All right, so the Taliban have put out that the U.S. needs to stick to that August 31st red line, or that there's going to be problems. Now, I'm not sure if the U.S. really just needed several hours into the September 1st, or even a few days, or maybe a week, if the Taliban wouldn't be willing to negotiate on that. We have seen in the past with Biden blowing the May 1st deadline date, the Taliban were willing to work and extend it and engage in diplomacy. It's crazy that you have all these U.S. representatives is saying that the Taliban are terrorists and you could never, negotiate with them. The U.S. has successfully negotiated with the Taliban, where we've not only broken the agreement with them, but they haven't killed an American in 18 months in Afghanistan, even though the U.S. has continued to carry out heavy airstrikes against the Taliban. It shows that you can negotiate diplomatically with the Taliban, and that these narratives that you can't are completely ridiculous. So maybe the U.S. could negotiate with the Taliban. The CIA director, William Burns, recently made a visit to Kabul and apparently met with the, I guess, guy who's kind of at least the face of the Taliban government right now in Afghanistan, that being Abdul Ghani Baradar, who was one time, I believe, in Qatar, but is now back in the country. So with Baradar in charge, he met with William Burns. I'm not, obviously we don't know what was discussed, and if the CIA did say what was discussed, I would, be at least a little skeptical about that. But assuming they're talking logistics and plans and trying to make sure this thing doesn't fall apart, there is a huge risk that something could really go wrong right here. Afghanistan is a country that's seen a lot of suicide bombings or terrorist attacks in the past 20 years. Some of them committed by the Taliban, some of them committed by the Islamic State Khorasan group, which is an enemy of the Taliban. In fact, in the past year, the Taliban have been the American anti-ISIS fighting force, the most effective one that they've had in Afghanistan. We backed it with air power, and so it could be that ISIS sets off a bomb. There was a case also, you just look at the desperation of civilians, especially, as the days dwindle and it becomes maybe increasingly clear to people that they're not going to be one of the Afghans that get to leave the country. What crazy things that people may do in desperation. There was an exchange of gunfire outside of the Kabul airport. No U.S. personnel were hurt, but apparently the U.S. military did engage. I guess what the U.S. was describing of one, their Afghan forces were killed. So I guess maybe they still are employing like 100 or so thousand, maybe people, former members of the Afghan National Army, who are, I would imagine the U.S. will agree to take them when they leave. And at this point, they're providing maybe the most direct security between the U.S. and the Taliban, or not Taliban, maybe the Taliban, but also the Afghan citizens looking to leave the country. We continue to get these images of, people either climbing over barriers or having, handing their children over. I'm not exactly sure why this is happening and people aren't going through the typical processing areas. The Western media is portraying this, the Taliban aren't letting people get through certain checkpoints, but it's all presented as being the fault and the problem of the Taliban cruelty, and not the cruelty that the U.S. has inflicted in this 20-year war and occupation against the Taliban. I guess the only other like real news story I have from Afghanistan is that Iran has started to allow fuel exports to return to Afghanistan. There's a report that these exports are happening at a far lower tariff. Not sure if this is something that Iran is just kind of leaning on the Taliban to save some money on it, or maybe if there's an increased security concern, and so to get the shipping companies to go with it, they have to have more margin of error, and that's the cause of the lowered tariffs coming into Afghanistan for this fuel. But it does go to show that the Taliban are having successful, somewhat diplomatic relations with neighboring states like Iran, like Pakistan, and they're making some trade through those borders, and that's going to be key for Afghanistan to not fall into a more hellish state. Now, I want to talk quickly about one narrative that's been coming out on Afghanistan. There's this really great graph in The Economist to talk about this. So the point that a lot of people have been making, especially the war hawks that want to continue this war, is that this occupation can go on at relatively low cost. And, they say this as low cost because there's a few number of American soldiers dying. Well, this graph from The Economist shows that while there's not many U.S. soldiers dying, and in fact that number is pretty much zero for again over the past year now, it is zero. But there's a huge number of Afghan forces who are being killed, and also civilians who are being killed in the country, thousands of them every single year. And so these are the exact civilians that they're saying we had to continue this low cost occupation to save, and yet they ignore that their warfare is a huge risk to these civilians and is in no way low cost. And in fact, it's the Trump administration really ramped up their airstrikes and killed thousands of civilians, and I'm sure it's thousands of more than admit it. And also they count a lot of Taliban fighters as civilian, or a lot of civilians as Taliban fighters, especially since the Trump administration spent several years just bombing Afghanistan's what they believed was Afghanistan's drug trade. And then the number of Afghan fighters that are being killed, this can't be considered at all low cost either in any way, especially when you look at the U.S. has developed this war economy in Afghanistan. I'm sure there's a lot less industry and legal industry that's, not opium based there now than before. All the economy goes through the U.S. And so if you're a young man in Afghanistan, even if you really don't want to go enlist and fight the Taliban, that's not really your thing. Just the way to make money, the way to have a life. We see this in the U.S. that there's an economic draft, essentially, that if you're a poor person, it's one of your ways to make a living in life. And so we have to realize that there's a lot of these deaths. These are maybe people that are just diehard, want to fight for their country and would have died fighting the Taliban anyways, but rather people the U.S. essentially economically forced into the military that we built to fight the Taliban, and these have to be included in the cost of the U.S. And they can't just be written, they were Afghan security forces, so their lives don't matter at all. All these lives absolutely matter, and it's absolutely horrific what the U.S. has done to that country. All right, the last story I have on Afghanistan just gets into the polling numbers here about the withdrawal. And I want to make a couple points clear, because there is a lot of rightful, I think, anger in the United States about how this withdrawal has been handled. And if you look at this CBS poll from YouGov, removal of U.S. troops from Afghanistan has gone 44% say very, very badly, 30% say somewhat badly, so that would be 74% saying badly, and then the 21% saying somewhat well, and 5% saying very well. Now, I do think Biden obviously is responsible in to some extent for a poor withdrawal. I think that the withdrawal was going to go somewhat badly, no matter how the withdrawal was planned, and that this was just a consequence of the 20-year war in Afghanistan. It's like if the U.S. stopped quantitative easing and people lost money, that even if there's a better way to unwind or to stop printing money, or a slower way to do it, something like that, if you just go the rip the band-aid off method or something like that, maybe there's an increase in consequences, but it was never going to be perfect in the first place, and that's a really important thing to remember here. But even with that, 63% of Americans do approve of removing U.S. troops. So as bad as the withdrawal has gone, Americans are still withdrawing troops, and I think that number has decreased a little bit, but at the same time, Americans have not turned against the withdrawal. And I think this is really important news, because the corporate press is really trying to spin this as and teaching a political lesson to presidents that, hey, if you end a war, your poll numbers are going to go down. And it's, I think, really important to note that is if the Biden administration maybe could have done this with less bad press, that even with the numbers where they are, people still support the withdrawal. I don't think his presidential numbers would have gotten as bad. Now, it also would have helped had he, prefaced this with the American people that, hey, this might get ugly, that the government could fall quickly, that this has been a debacle for 20 years, and we have built a government on, I would say quicksand, but that's not, it's just on water. And as soon as we remove the flotation device that we've been providing, this thing could sink in an absolute second. And it's something that we have to realize. Had he been more open, I think his poll numbers would probably hurt less. And Americans would probably say that this is just going somewhat badly at a higher percentage than very badly. But again, it would have had to have been planned just a little bit better too. And that would have come, with being more honest with the American people. All right, everybody, that's everything I have on Afghanistan for today. Of course, I'll have more on this in the coming weeks as the drawdown continues. We see what decisions that Biden makes, when the decisions get tough, when there's people outside the Kabul airport, when the corporate press is crying that you're condemning these hundreds or thousands of people to death by leaving them and exiting on the 31st, if Biden will be able to stick to it and do it, and if we don't have if we don't fall off the tip of this this knife right now that we are on in Afghanistan, and don't have some violent act at the Kabul airport in the meantime.